Rome believed itself invincible. Its legions marched across scorching deserts, pushed through dense forests, and climbed frozen mountains with one unshakable certainty: they would win. For Romans, defeat was an aberration, something that happened to barbarians, to the weak, to those who ignored Mars, god of war. But that arrogance had a price. In this video, you'll meet the 10 enemy commanders who humiliated Rome, men who defied the greatest power of the ancient world, and proved that even history's most feared empire could bleed. Long before Rome ruled the world, it nearly vanished. In 390 BC, when it was still an expanding republic, the city faced a brutal enemy from the north, the Senan Gauls, led by a warrior chieftain named Brennus. These Gauls weren't a formal army, but a migrating warband, armed to the teeth and hungry for land and plunder. They carried long swords, oval shields, and fought with a ferocity that terrified their enemies. Rome, overconfident in its recent rise, sent troops to meet them on the banks of the river Allia. The battlefield was poorly chosen. The Roman formation stretched too thin, and when the Gauls charged, their wild strength and numbers shattered the Roman lines. It was a fatal mistake. The Roman army was slaughtered. Survivors fled in chaos, some drowning in the river, others cut down as they ran. With no organized resistance left, nothing stopped the Gauls from marching straight to the city's gates. Rome lay defenseless. The Senate took refuge on the Capitoline Hill, where they prepared for a desperate stand, while much of the population abandoned their homes and sought safety in the countryside. Brennus entered a practically empty city and began the sack. Temples, homes, and monuments were desecrated or looted. For the Romans, it was not only physical destruction, but a profound psychological blow. But the most humiliating moment was still to come. To salvage what remained, the Romans offered gold in exchange for withdrawal. During the weighing, they realized the Gauls were using a rigged scale. When they protested, Brennus tossed his heavy sword onto the balance and declared, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. The message was clear: the defeated have no right to justice. Brennus's sack left the first gaping wound in Roman pride. The city was devastated, its people traumatized, and the memory haunted generations. Fear of the Gauls hardened into hatred, and that hatred would fuel future wars. Pyrrhus was not just a general, he was a king, a strategist, and a distant relative of Alexander the Great, with an ambition to match his lineage. When the Greek cities of southern Italy sought help against Rome's expansion, he saw a chance to build his own Western empire. Pyrrhus was renowned for his charisma and skill, able to command both loyalty and fear. He arrived not as a mercenary, but as a monarch with dreams of carving a Mediterranean dominion. What followed was a military and cultural clash without precedent. In 280 BC, Pyrrhus crossed the Ionian Sea with a professional army that dwarfed Rome's in organization and experience. His force included Macedonian phalanxes bristling with long sarissas, heavy cavalry trained in shock charges, skilled archers, and something the Romans had never encountered before: war elephants. At Heraclea, the Romans marched with their usual courage, but they were accustomed to flexible terrain-driven fighting. What they faced instead was a machine of war arranged in tight phalanx lines, unbreakable from the front, and guarded by towering beasts armored in iron. When the elephants charged, Roman horses panicked and infantry lines broke. Pyrrhus won the day, but at a steep cost. The next year at Asculum, the pattern repeated. Another Greek victory, but bought with terrible bloodshed. Both sides were exhausted, yet Rome could call on endless reserves, while Pyrrhus could not. Losses were so heavy that Pyrrhus himself is said to have remarked, "Another victory like this, and I am undone." From that campaign we inherit the phrase Pyrrhic victory. What most humiliated Rome was not only the result on the battlefield, but the nature of the defeat itself. For the first time, Rome faced an enemy who beat them not with numbers or luck, but with discipline, innovation, and superior tactics. Rome, which had mainly triumphed over tribal or loosely organized foes, found in Pyrrhus a mirror of what it had not yet become, a refined military power steeped in Hellenistic strategy. These defeats forced Rome to evolve. They adapted, reformed their legions, abandoned rigid phalanx-style tactics, and created a more flexible fighting force that would eventually outmatch the Greek way of war. But before that transformation was complete, a new nightmare arose, a commander who wouldn't just win battles but nearly broke Rome's spirit. If Brennus wounded Rome, and Pyrrhus forced it to rethink, Hannibal almost erased it from the map. Son of the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, Hannibal grew up under a vow to destroy Rome. From childhood, he was trained in war, taught strategy, and fed a hatred of the Republic. When the Second Punic War broke out, he didn't just honor his father's promise, he rewrote the rules of war. In 218 BC, he did the unthinkable. Instead of attacking by sea, as the Romans expected, Hannibal led his army over the Alps, dragging tens of thousands of soldiers, heavy cavalry, and about 40 war elephants through freezing passes. The crossing itself was an ordeal that became legendary. Snowstorms buried men alive, avalanches swept away supplies, and hostile tribes harassed his columns at every turn. Yet after weeks of suffering, Hannibal descended into Italy, battered but unbroken, ready to fight on Roman soil. What came next was a sequence of defeats that traumatized Rome. At the Trebia, Hannibal lured the Romans into icy waters and ambushed them from concealed positions. At Lake Trasimene, he used the fog and the terrain to trap and annihilate an entire Roman army in one of the largest ambushes in history. And in 216 BC, at Cannae, he reached the peak of his genius, executing a double envelopment that destroyed 8 Roman legions in a single day. With a smaller army, he encircled and crushed 8 Roman legions. More than 50,000 men may have died in a single day, one of the greatest slaughters in military history. Rome went into psychological collapse. The scale of the disaster was almost incomprehensible. Entire generations of soldiers were wiped out, and the city itself trembled at the thought that nothing could stop Hannibal. Allied cities, seeing Rome weakened, defected to Carthage. The Senate panicked, fearing that Hannibal would march directly on the capital. For 15 years, he roamed Italy like an unstoppable shadow, moving from region to region, destroying armies, devastating crops, and keeping Rome permanently on the defensive. He was never defeated on Italian soil. Though eventually recalled to North Africa to defend Carthage against Scipio Africanus, where he was finally beaten at the Battle of Zama, Hannibal left behind an open wound. His very name became legend. Roman parents calmed disobedient children with the warning, Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. No other enemy inspired such terror in the Roman imagination. As Rome consolidated control of the Mediterranean, it assumed the Iberian Peninsula would be just another province to tame. Instead, it met an enemy like few before Viriathus. He wasn't a king or a trained general. He was a Lusitanian shepherd who became one of Iberia's greatest resistance leaders. Thrust into command, out of necessity, Viriathus transformed his humble background into a weapon. He knew every mountain pass, every ravine, every valley of his rugged homeland. What he lacked in numbers and equipment, he made up for in cunning. His army was small, poorly armed compared to the heavily equipped legions, but it was lethal in its mobility. He turned the land itself into his strongest ally. Roman patrols were ambushed on narrow trails, columns harassed and cut apart, camps raided at night. When the Romans tried to pin him down, his men melted into the mountains, only to reappear days later to strike again. It was guerrilla warfare in its purest form, centuries before the term would even exist. Rome, accustomed to formal open-field battle, found itself facing an enemy who refused to play by its rules. One by one, Roman commanders sent to destroy him suffered humiliating defeats. Some were killed outright, others forced to retreat in disgrace. Viriathus's reputation grew so great that in a rare moment of pragmatism, the Roman Senate recognized his authority and signed peace treaties with him, a humiliating concession for a republic that almost never acknowledged legitimacy in its enemies. But Rome's patience had limits. Unable to crush him on the battlefield, the Romans turned to betrayal. They bribed 3 of Viriathus' closest lieutenants, who murdered him while he slept. Yet when the killers came to collect their reward, they were told coldly, "Rome does not pay traitors." Viriathus did not just resist Rome, he became a symbol of defiance, proving that courage, cunning, and an intimate knowledge of the land could outweigh the might of legions. His example echoed for centuries in the memory of Iberian peoples. Rome was the Mediterranean's dominant power when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. After defeating Pompey in the civil war, Caesar intervened in the Ptolemaic succession, supporting Cleopatra against her brother Ptolemy XIII. In doing so, he underestimated the resilience of Egyptian pride and the determination of its leaders. While Caesar became entangled in palace intrigues, Cleopatra's younger sister Arsinoe IV escaped Roman custody and allied with the general Achilles, who commanded the Egyptian army. Together they seized control of thousands of soldiers and turned the entire city of Alexandria against Caesar. What followed was a siege that tested Rome's greatest general. Caesar and his men were isolated inside the royal palace, cut off from supplies, and forced to defend themselves against constant attacks in the city's narrow streets. Egyptian forces burned sections of his fleet in the harbor, and every attempt to resupply the Romans was met with fierce resistance. Caesar ordered makeshift fortifications and fought day and night, but the humiliation was clear to all. Rome, which dictated terms to kings, now found its most famous commander trapped and begging for reinforcements. The Mediterranean watched in disbelief as the conqueror of Gaul and victor of countless battles was held down by a kingdom that Rome had considered a client state. Only with the arrival of Mithridates of Pontus and his auxiliary forces did Caesar finally break the siege and reassert control. He emerged victorious, but the damage to Roman prestige was done. The episode proved that even Caesar, the man who seemed untouchable, could be cornered. For the Egyptians, however brief the moment, it was a glorious memory, proof that their ancient kingdom could make Rome bleed in its own house. Arminius, the ghost of Teutoburg Forest. Arminius was the type of enemy Rome feared most, one it had created itself. Born among the Cherusei, a Germanic tribe beyond the Rhine, he was sent to Rome as a hostage in a political arrangement. There he grew up in the heart of Roman society, trained in military tactics, educated in Latin, and granted citizenship. He rose through the ranks of the Roman auxiliary forces, eventually serving as an officer. To Roman eyes, he was the perfect example of a barbarian transformed by civilization. But beneath the surface, Arminius never forgot his origins or the suffering Rome had inflicted on his people. He wore the Roman uniform and carried its honors, all the while plotting revenge. In AD 9, while serving as advisor to Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania, Arminius set his trap. He warned Varus of a supposed local rebellion and convinced him to march 3 legions, about 20,000 men, into the dense and unfamiliar terrain of the Teutoburg forest. The ground was marshy, the paths narrow, and the weather turned against them with relentless rain. Roman columns stretched for kilometers, unable to maneuver or form proper battle lines. It was the perfect killing ground. For 3 days, Germanic warriors struck from the trees, hurling spears and launching furious charges before vanishing back into the forest. Roman shields and armor became heavy with mud, their formations collapsed, and panic spread. Surrounded on all sides, with no visibility and no hope of reinforcement, the legions were butchered. When the massacre ended, almost nothing remained. The sacred legionary eagles, The standards that embodied Roman honor were captured. Varus, unable to face the shame, fell on his own sword. Survivors were enslaved or sacrificed in grim rituals. The shock in Rome was immense. Emperor Augustus, upon hearing of the disaster, is said to have torn his clothes and cried out, "Varus, give me back my legions." The defeat was more than military, it was psychological. For the first time, Rome confronted the reality that its power had limits. From that day forward, the dream of conquering Germania was abandoned, and the forests beyond the Rhine remained Rome's frontier. The Rhine frontier became permanent. Arminius was no mere barbarian. He was the architect of Rome's worst defeat to that time, a scar even centuries couldn't erase. In the 3rd century, Rome entered one of its most fragile phases. The empire bled from within, shaken by internal rebellions, economic collapse, inflation, civil wars, and an endless wave of invasions across its frontiers. Amid this chaos, a new power rose in the east, the Sasanian Empire. At its center stood Shapur-Entit, an ambitious Persian king whose vision was not limited to defense. He sought to expand over Mesopotamia and far beyond, challenging Roman dominance in the east. While Rome staggered to hold its borders together, Shapur struck with precision. His offensives were not random raids, but carefully planned campaigns that threatened the very balance of power. He did not merely test the frontier, he sought to seize it and humiliate his rival. In AD 260, the elderly Emperor Valerian, desperate to reassert Roman authority, chose to lead a campaign in person. His army, weakened by plague, stretched thin and poorly supplied, marched to Edessa, where it was crushed in a catastrophic defeat. What followed was unprecedented in Roman history. Valerian, emperor of the greatest empire in the known world, was captured alive. The mere thought had once been unthinkable, yet Shapur turned this victory into something far more than a military triumph. He transformed Valerian into a living symbol of Rome's humiliation. Ancient accounts claim that the emperor was forced to kneel so that Shapur could use him as a human step to mount his horse. After Valerian's death, his skin was allegedly flayed, stuffed, and displayed in a Persian temple as a war trophy. Whether fact or propaganda, the story spread like wildfire across the empire. For Rome, this was not simply a battlefield loss, it was an affront to imperial dignity itself. Never before, and never again, was a Roman emperor captured in battle. The news shattered morale among the legions, shocked citizens, and sent provinces into despair. For centuries, Rome had been more than just a city, it was a symbol, the eternal city. Home of the gods, seat of an empire that believed itself untouchable. But by the early 5th century, that illusion began to crumble. The Western Empire reeled under the weight of political instability, treachery among generals, economic decay, and constant external threats pressing in on every side. Into this atmosphere of weakness and betrayal stepped Alaric, king of the Visigoths. Once an ally of Rome, he had served as an auxiliary commander and knew the empire's strengths and weaknesses firsthand. Yet Rome betrayed him, dishonored treaties, and denied him rewards promised for his service. Tired of broken promises, Alaric resolved to march directly against the heart of his frustration, Rome itself. In AD 410, after a tense siege, the walls of the city finally opened. For the first time in almost 8 centuries, a foreign enemy entered the Roman capital. For 3 days, the Visigoths plundered the city. Temples, homes, and palaces were stripped bare. Though churches were largely respected, everything else was left to pillage. Rome was not razed, but the damage was irreparable. Psychologically, symbolically, and historically, the heart of the empire had been violated. The intellectual Jerome, writing in shock, declared, "The world is in ruins." Alaric had not destroyed Rome with fire and slaughter alone. He had shattered the very idea of Rome as the untouchable center of the world. He proved that the empire's heart could be pierced, that the protection of the gods was no longer certain, and that the myth of eternal invulnerability was dead. If Alaric cracked Rome's myth, Genseric sealed its fate. 45 years after the first sack, the city still stood, but it was only a shell of its former self. The Western Empire was crumbling under the weight of corruption, power struggles, succession crises, and the collapse of its administration. Then came the final blow, not from land but from the sea. Genseric, king of the Vandals, had carved out a naval empire in North Africa, ruling from Carthage and controlling the vital grain and trade routes of the Mediterranean. His fleets made him master of the seas, and his ambitions turned inevitably toward Rome. When Emperor Valentinian III was murdered, a ruler who had promised his daughter in marriage to Genseric's son, the Vandal king seized upon the perfect pretext. With meticulous preparation, he assembled his fleet and sailed directly for Rome. The city was defenseless. Petronius Maximus, the new emperor, fled in panic, only to be torn apart by his own people as he tried to escape. When Genseric's fleet arrived, Rome offered no resistance. The gates opened, and the conquerors entered. But unlike Alaric, who had plundered for 3 days and departed, Genseric remained for 2 full weeks. His sack was not a chaotic frenzy, but a methodical dismantling. Religious relics, masterpieces of art, gold, silver, statues, and everything of value was seized and carried off to Africa. This was not a firestorm, it was a systematic stripping of Rome's soul. The blow was so devastating that centuries later, the word vandalism would be coined, not for what he destroyed, but for what he emptied. Genseric did not burn Rome to the ground. He left it hollow, without its treasures, without its dignity, without its aura of glory. What remained was not an eternal city, but an imperial shell. With that sack, the West was no longer Rome, it was only ruin, waiting for the end. Rome had once seen itself as eternal, more than just an empire. It believed it was an idea, a promise of order, civilization, and absolute dominion over the known world. But that illusion shattered piece by piece, with every defeat, every humiliation, every scar, inflicted by the enemies you have heard about here. These commanders, so different in their origins and methods, all proved the same point. Rome was not invincible. Each in their own way left wounds on the empire's memory, wounds no monument, no triumphal march, and no statue could ever erase. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to keep exploring the great stories of the past, and leave a comment. Which of these generals do you think humiliated Rome the most? And may Mars guide you in battle.